Okay, everybody. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for making the time to get here. And this is the first event in a day-long worldwide conference called For One Day Only. And the design has about 6 or 7 different events in 6 or 7 different cities and countries. And we roll around the world, starting here at the ANU, progressing on later in the day to Helsinki, Rome, Lucerne, London, Johannesburg, Virginia, and tomorrow morning, bright and early, I think 9:30 in the morning, back to the University of Melbourne, so that we roll around the world in the course of the day. It's a 24-hour virtual conference for a non-travelling global audience. And partly, because of that kind of design, we're focusing on themes of legal space and legal geography. These, as I'm sure you all know, have been important focuses of research in socio-legal scholarship and in law and the humanities in recent years. And we're exploring today, in this session in particular, but also in the other sessions, how the experience of public space has been transformed under pressures of neoliberal ideology and contemporary governmentality, looking at questions like biopolitics, securitisation, public space, democracy, and in some places we're going to be looking also at questions about how the pandemic has also constrained, revealed or accelerated those processes. What are the opportunities or challenges facing us today? And this is the first event in that series, and it's called Marketplace. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum, a little reference there to Stephen Sondheim for those in the know. And we're looking precisely at these kinds of questions about historical, theoretical and experiential intersections of law, power and public space. And I'm really delighted to welcome Margaret Davies and Chris Butler to the panel. As I'm sure you know, we were meant to be joined also by Jessica White, who's done some really wonderful work recently about histories and philosophies of neoliberalism, particularly in a book called Morals of the Market. Unfortunately, she's a victim of the kind of stresses that working from home and remote learning and teaching has placed on academics as well as other workers around Australia, and she's kind of a late cancellation. So I'm sorry that Jessica can't be with us. And I'm going to do some pinch hitting for Jessica and fill the gap with a paper of my own on these subjects. So good day to everybody, and good day in particular to Professor Margaret Davies. Margaret, it's wonderful to have you here. Margaret's the Matthew Flinders Distinguished Professor at Flinders University and the author of many books, including Law Unlimited, Materialism, Pluralism and Legal Theory. And she's going to be talking today around the subject of the living nomos. Margaret, take it away.
Thank you, Des, and thank you everyone for attending today. It's really wonderful. I think this is a fantastic way to hold a conference, and I'm really looking forward to joining in some of the other sessions later as well. And I'm very pleased to be first in line, really, with my paper, which I've entitled Living Nomos, but it's kind of, that's just a holding place, really. So what I'm going to talk about today is the book that I'm currently writing. I'm towards the end of writing that book. I've called it Eco Law, and I'm going to use my time today to outline the argument of the book. First, by way of introduction, what do I mean by eco law and where is it situated theoretically? Eco law is not, in the way I'm using it, human law that governs the environment or ecosystems. It is law that emerges from the matter of the world. And that distinction is critical. Much has been made in recent theory about Foucault's notion of biopower and biopolitics as the governance of life and of bodies by human regulatory systems. And as Elizabeth Gross explains, for Foucault, biopower regulates a body from the outside. She points out that an alternative idea of biopower could refer to the powers that operate in and through living bodies. Although he didn't deploy such a notion of biopower, Gross reads Foucault as suggesting that geopower, by contrast to biopower, is a power that is embedded in the earth. She says, quote, rather than concede geopower as the power that humans can extract from or hold over the geological, he sees geopower as the forces of the earth. Now, I don't personally know enough about Foucault to comment on his notion of geopower, but it's really the distinction that is important here between power over the earth and power that emerges from the earth. And with the idea of eco-law and the subcategories which I use throughout the book in various contexts, subcategories of geolaw and biolaw, I'm aiming to make an aligned distinction to the distinction that Gross makes in that passage. The term eco-law doesn't refer to the limited domain of human law that governs the earth, but rather to the unlimited domain of law that emerges from life and from the earth. Eco-law connects biolaw, geolaw, and indeed human law. And in so doing, it connects legal theory with what I understand to be in my reading of the science theory of recent decades. And my understanding of that theory is that it has displaced deterministic mechanical laws with more probabilistic laws that engage agency, purpose, and constrained choice. There are mechanical laws, of course, but much earth-based matter is governed by emergent systems based on probabilities, not certainties. And finally, by way of introduction, I'd say that in keeping with my previous work, I don't make a firm distinction between the idea of law and norm. What is known in Western legal theory as formal state-based law is emergent from, reliant upon, and ultimately blended into an extended field of norms in all of their plurality and materiality. So a series of thoughts frame this work, and I'll just run through those thoughts before elaborating a little bit further on what's contained in it. Some of the thoughts, especially the first one, is quite familiar from Robert Cover, Nomos and Narrative. His famous first line, we inhabit a nomos, a normative universe. And that really does say a lot about what I'm trying to do in this book. The second thought is that the nomos or normative universe emerges from material processes, but it can't be reduced to them in any mechanical sense. That is, norms emerge from the movement and interactions of matter at cosmic and geological scales within life and across ecosystems. Thirdly, emergent normativity is contingent yet stable and therefore accumulative, or in social terms, it's historical and constantly diversifying and changing. And that leads forth to normalities and systems that are plural, complex and intersecting, but ontologically continuous. Relationships across normative scales, scales such as life, meaning, bodies, state law, microbes and earth, those relationships are ubiquitous. The normative universe is interconnected and layered, not separated into bits. Legal systems and other human legalities are embedded within this universe, not separate from it. And finally, whilst normativity is in one sense coexistent with order, in fact, order and disorder are not distinct, but always co-implicated. Normativity implies sameness, but relies upon difference, just as order implies system, but relies upon disorder or chaos. In summary, then, there are 5 key thoughts. We inhabit a nomos. It emerges from matter and from physical processes. It's historical and cumulative. It's plural and constantly diversifying. And it rests on an interplay of order and disorder, sameness and difference. Excuse me. So I use the term eco-law then to denote this interconnected and plural nomos. I could have used the term eco-nomos, which I think would denoted more exactly the title of this session, the coming together of oikos and nomos as a law of exchange. But I wanted to retain the familiarity and the resonance of the idea of law in writing this book. So that's an introduction. Excuse me, I'll just, no, it's all good. That's an introduction and a summary of the 5 framing ideas. The next section that I want to talk about is really an elaboration of this in a little bit more detail. So this story about law, nature and normativity that I develop begins with the order, disorder, adaptive properties and emergent nature of earthly existence, both living and non-living. Rather than focus on particular organisms or assemblages as entities or systems, my emphasis is on understanding the norm-creative iterations and bonds that both establish and disrupt the patterns of life and non-life. And in this, I adopt Georges Canguilhem's fullest sense of normative to refer to processes which create norms in a dynamic nomos. So for him, normativity is not so much a thing, but rather a process of creating norms. Normativity is that which creates norms. As I've alluded to in my opening, human law is also often understood as a separate sphere of activity that constructs the physical world. Human law is often seen to shape, categorise and determine the physical world. But that's only the beginning of the story that connects law and the non-human. It's possible to hypothesise a dynamic image in which all law, including the formal law of nation states, is completely enmeshed in socio-ecological processes. Human law is constituted as such by multiple intersecting and co-constitutive socio-ecological normative fields, from microbes to artistic endeavours to philosophy and forests. Intellectually, this image of intersecting plural normative worlds is an extension of the well-established but human-centred studies by legal anthropologists and sociologists of the way that human normative systems, living law, plural cultural worlds and everyday normative practices are connected to and inform state law. So we can extend anthropology and the sociology of law, of human legal systems rather, to be inclusive of life generally. That is, the bionorms from which we and all surrounding life forms are constituted. But such an extended nomos doesn't end with life, only to be taken over by purely causal physical laws. Rather, normative earth systems and the big composite of multiple systems, Gaia, are composed of agential, patterned and purposeful non-living as well as living matter. Broadly speaking, my image is a bit like that of Eugen Ehrlich's living law, only bigger, more extensive. A living law beyond human life and ingrained in the life of the earth. Now, what concept of norm could possibly cover all of that field? My working idea of norms, both legal and non-legal, human and non-human, is that they are iterative, connective, and teleological. So I'll just explain that a little bit more. First, norms are the product of iteration or continued usage, things being done, thought, or spoken the same way repeatedly, but always accompanied by the potential for difference. This account of normativity is derived from the French tradition of Canguilhem, Foucault and Derrida. The emphasis is on Derrida, but I do make quite a lot of use of the work of Canguilhem in his discussion of vital normativity. Norms also arise from exchanges, entanglements and bonds between organisms, including humans, and between bits of matter. Bonds constitute and differentiate, they mediate self and other, they create obligations. Speaking of electrons and other quantum things, Karen Barad says entanglements are not a name for the interconnectedness of all beings as one, but rather specific material relations of the ongoing differentiating of the world. Entanglements are relations of obligation, being bound to the other, enfolded traces of othering. To use the legal terminology then, norms, both human and non-human, are basically habitual or customary and contractual, created by coming together and relating. And I could mention in that context Anna Greer's concept of symbiotic normativities, or normativities that are based on symbiosis or beyond that, symbiosis, the biological process. So finally, norms are aligned with and motivated by purposes, even if in many instances the purpose is forgotten, minimal or buried. Teleology, or purpose-driven action, or action that follows a direction, is normative. It creates norms. And to speak of teleology in this context doesn't imply motivation, either by a beginning, such as a creation or even an intention, or an end, such as a final or perfect condition. Those things are beyond the pale for physical and biological sciences, but they have adopted a different notion of teleology in many contexts. Nor does teleology imply singularity or linearity. Teleology in this context is simply direction, a direction for self-organisation and self-preservation. So norms are always contingent, as I've mentioned, in the sense that they could have been otherwise. Repetition can always be performed differently. Bonds can be broken or reforged. Moreover, norms don't lead to determined results. There can always be, and often are, deviations, sometimes leading to new norms. My objective then in this book is to explore these three constitutive elements of norms: repetition, bonds, and purpose, across human and non-human life and in non-life. Obviously, I don't say anything original about the physical world. My idea rather is to expand the language of legal theory to more than human situations. Finally, then, I just want to say something about the continuities and discontinuities between human laws and this wider normative universe. Canguilhem said life is in fact a normative activity. And moreover, he said we do not ascribe a human content to vital or living norms, but we do ask ourselves how normativity essential to human consciousness would be explained if it did not in some way exist in embryo in life. In other words, I take him to be suggesting that all of the interacting complexity of human normativity depends in some way on a more basic biological normativity that exists well beyond the space occupied by the human being. Viruses, for instance, also have their norms, and these are clearly not separate from human life and human norms, but rather interact with them for better and worse. Looking even further past biology to non-living processes, Ilya Prigogine said human creativity and innovation can be understood as the amplification of laws of nature already present in physics or chemistry. This sounds like a very large claim. He was talking about the second law of thermodynamics, which addresses the directed spread of energy in particular. And Prigogine's research in far from equilibrium physical systems has allowed incredible depth and detail to be observed and understood in the continuities and connections between non-life and life, and between human and non-human. And I want to explore that in according to a framing of normativity. So how is it possible to understand this continuity of the normativity of the non-living, the living and the human within the terms offered by legal theory? The dominant assumption, practice and idiom about law, derived from legal positivist theory that we're all familiar with, is that law is largely conceptual. Despite the inbuilt requirement that law become practical at some point, in this perspective, law is nonetheless often regarded as having a life of its own as abstract. Law's essence, though expressed via the physical medium of language and memorialised in permanent form as documents, is still mainly viewed as conceptual. Law may have its origins in social relationships, but is conceptually detached from them. We still come across that view and work with it quite frequently. And strongly associated with the view that law can be distinguished from material practices and in some way precedes them or governs them is that it's singular and state-based. There's one law, one state and sovereign, one territory, one legal world. This idea of law imagines itself as separate from any broader image of eco-law, but it's nonetheless produced by and within it. And by contrast to these top-down and conceptual approaches to state-based law, the pragmatic, sociological and anthropological traditions in legal thought, as well as much of the critical tradition, are more likely to explain law as having a material basis, as emerging from the relationships of humans in their specific communities and located in place and time. Law is situated in and interpreted by reference to social meanings and everyday practices that are necessarily place emergent and historically located. My argument about the continuity of normativity across the differentiated spheres of the human and the non-human is in fact quite straightforward. It simply involves a shift in orientation from a human-centric focus to a matter-centric focus. Looking past the taxonomies that enforce the human-non-human divide necessitates that we see that these spheres, while separable for some purposes, are nonetheless unified by matter and the processes that shape it. There is no getting away from human dependence on the physical world, living and non-living, and since this is the case, an explanation of law that is confined to the human is only telling part of the story of law. The physicality of human bodies conversing and acting with others in physical locations with and in relation to physical objects is not always foremost or even present in positivist and even in critical socio-legal accounts of law, but it is nonetheless necessary to them. Legal geography in many ways stands out among the critical traditions in integrating law with place, where both law and place are understood as comprised of matter and practices that are social, historical and ecological. It therefore engages directly with the non-human and physical elements of law emergence. Theoretical approaches to law based on material practices tend to avoid depictions of law as logical, systematic or singular. As an emergent thing, law is necessarily based on diversity and contestation, as well as on the singularizing and reifying impulses of its more abstract discourses. In one sense, the point that human normativity is situated within natural normativity is obvious, even trite. If the human species is simply part of an extended biophysical sphere, which I think is an obvious point, then everything that is of the human sphere is also of the natural sphere. We humans are a subset of a larger set. We don't overlap with nature, we are inside it. So that's the starting point of everything that I'm writing about and thinking about in this book that I'm currently working on. And I'll just conclude now because I think my time's probably up. Basically, because the human being is an organism and in fact a living system, the material explanation of law can't stop at merely human relationships. There's no boundary that can be drawn around the human organism in a material sense. There are, of course, many discursive and mythological boundaries that have been placed around humans and human societies, especially in Western thought. However, as we are seeing all around us, the image of isolation from our habitat and broader environment is a destructive myth. One biology article aptly puts it, we have never been individuals. Law as an ecological phenomenon emerges from trillions of micro actions of such living systems in specific places and times. This constant activity, like the biochemical reactions that generate it, forms patterns and stabilities that over time materialise as law. There is nothing that is law that does not emerge from this material context or that can be explained or understood without it. Even the most idealist and conceptual understanding of law cannot divorce it from the physical natural world. Everything that we refer to as law, therefore, emerges in a context of physical action, even though it's reified into an abstract form. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. That's really fascinating, and it's really wonderful to see you thinking through this question. I know you've been working on this for quite a while now, and it's really great to hear the shape that this is coming to. So I'm going to cross straight away to Chris. I first came across Chris's work on applying Henri Lefebvre to law quite a long time ago, and it's work that's always stayed with me. So I'm really delighted to have Chris on the panel today. And Chris is going to be talking about, within that same kind of area of legal geography, in a different way, I guess, housing, dwelling, and modernity. Thanks, Chris.
All right, so thanks again, Des, for organising this event. Thanks to Margaret, and thanks to Jihan for the organisation behind the scenes. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the base of Kagur Mabul in southern Brisbane. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, which is land that's never been ceded. So I extend all my respects to the First Nations peoples joining this event. And as Des said, I've been working on material about space, legal geography, politics for quite a while. And so this project that I'm engaging in here is, I'm sort of loosely using this term, the politics of inhabitants, which I'm framing in terms of the body's material occupation of space, the ways in which we creatively appropriate space, but also the utopian ambitions which are inherent in any occupation of space, the attempts to exceed what we think of or come up against as the existing boundaries between the possible and the impossible. So, yes, this project is in some ways guided by Lefebvre still. That won't be a surprise to any of you who know my work or who have been sort of following what I do over the last decade or so. But I'm wanting to use Lefebvre's ideas, things that come from work like the production of space and the right to the city, to investigate ways in which neoliberal urbanism not only generates new forms of spatial injustice, but has also worked to crush the remnants of any post-war welfare state dreams of egalitarian forms of urban life. And this is what the Polish architect and urban scholar Łukasz Stanek describes as collective luxury. And so in this context, one of the most prominent and highly charged issues associated with forms of urban injustice is the issues of housing. So it's affordability, its availability, and the adequacy of housing. And this is not a problem which is just affecting Australia, but it affects almost every major city in the world, as processes of financialisation and commodification of housing have become a central source of capital accumulation. So in recent years, the public focus on rising levels of housing unaffordability and homelessness has been most intense in Sydney. And it's very common just in everyday sort of media speak to refer to the housing crisis as if that's a kind of normal state of affairs. So in this context, there was a lot of public attention that was directed in 2014 towards the New South Wales government's appalling decision to sell off almost 300 public housing dwellings in inner Sydney and to relocate residents to other localities. One particular site of struggle, which I've written about in a couple of pieces, is the forced evictions of tenants, public housing tenants, from the famous Sirius building in the Rocks. And so this was the source of a quite significant social movement, really, sort of almost reenacting the events of the 1970s when there was a green ban implemented in that area of Sydney. And in fact, the Sirius building was originally designed and built as part of a compromise between the residents of the rocks and housing authorities in exchange for a lifting of the BLF's green ban on the area. So like many buildings, particularly public housing complexes which have worn the tag of brutalism, this sort of architectural style which has generated a lot of controversy, the Sirius building has also been the subject of controversy and public debate since its completion in 1980. It's long been the target. When it was in public hands, it was the target of hostility from the Liberal Party governing New South Wales, particularly because of its associations with the Green Ban movement and because it's a symbol of an important victory for local democracy in the Rocks area during the 1970s. So the sale of the building, the tenants were all moved out, and the final sale was concluded in the middle of 2019. And then 2 years later, so in June this year, 80% of the newly refurbished luxury apartments that had been sort of constructed in this building were sold in one weekend for almost $450 million. So that was, a kind of tripling of the value that was paid for the building when it was sold by the state government. So given the contested history of this building, this final shift of harbourside public housing to private hands is certainly an historical political defeat for the idea of collective luxury as an emancipatory project. So even though we've seen in the last year, or particularly in the beginning part of 2020, with the initial sort of panic around the COVID-19 pandemic, there were very, very rapid responses to precarious housing circumstances, with the idea that perhaps homeless populations or people living in precarious housing might actually be a public health problem for those who aren't in precarious circumstances. So hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on interventions to address rough sleeping, street homelessness, and moratoriums on evictions. But the character of that kind of response, which really did reveal what the state could be capable of in terms of addressing precarious housing if it really needed to be done, the character of that response was temporary. It was ad hoc and unsystematic, and was more a reflection of the fear that homeless populations posed to the non-homeless population than any more sort of thoroughgoing attempt to address this housing crisis. And we've already seen a return back to the lack of concern in the pre-pandemic era with issues of housing security and its broader connections to public health. So what I want to do in the remainder of this paper is just have a look at another aspect of the kind of cultural response to the pandemic, which I think has seen a notable shift towards a deepening attachment to one of the central tropes that's defined contemporary sociology and urban studies, and this is the concept of dwelling. So from the universalisation of this supposed capacity of all knowledge workers to work from home, to the fetish for DIY sourdough and craft activities, there's been an assumption that, for most of the last 18 months, that it is possible and indeed imperative for all of us to stay at home and seek sanctuary there, or perhaps seen in Heideggerian terms, to dwell. And I think this is of particular interest because of the way, for much of the last century, writing on the relationships between built form and processes of urbanisation has generally been dominated by the question of how it might be possible to dwell in conditions that appear so antithetical to forms of traditional dwelling that predate the emergence of the modern metropolis. So in the work of Hilda Heinen, she repeatedly returns to the problem of dwelling as emblematic of the challenges and dilemmas faced by contemporary architects, planners, and administrators who propose to reconcile social life with the experience of modernity. So I want to have a look at this relationship between the idea of dwelling and modernity in the contemporary metropolis. For most of the past, probably definitely 50 years, but probably almost 70 now, the most common philosophical inspiration for the questioning of the compatibility of dwelling with the contemporary metropolitan condition is Heidegger's 1951 essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking. And in this piece, Heidegger famously draws on the etymological origins of building to demonstrate the fundamental connections between building and dwelling. But rather than prioritising building as the basis of the forging of physical security, Heidegger sees dwelling as lying at the core of what it means for mortals to live on the earth. So, of particular importance for Heidegger is the concept of poetic dwelling. And this provides him with a way of distinguishing authentic dwelling from mere lodging. And in a famous interpretation of a poem by Hölderlin, Heidegger describes poetic dwelling as a form of measure-taking of both the earthly and divine elements of humanity's occupation of space. So it's therefore at odds with the forms of dwelling that have been promoted by the calculated decisionism of modernist spatial planning and systems of housing provision. Through the instrumental harnessing of technology to order the world and operate as a standing reserve for human consumption, Heidegger conceives the design of human settlement at that midpoint of the 20th century as being dominated by technical and functionalist requirements, which prevent us from appreciating the full poetic measure of our dwelling. So if Heidegger's account is accurate, it reintroduces the obvious question of whether it's possible any longer to talk of dwelling within the contemporary metropolis. So writing in the wake of the post-war housing reconstruction era, Heidegger asks, what's the state of dwelling in our precarious age? We hear talk about the housing shortage, and with good reason. We try to fill the need by providing houses. However hard and bitter, however hampering and threatening the lack of houses remains, the real plight of dwelling doesn't lie merely in a lack of houses. The real plight lies in this, that mortals ever search anew for the nature of dwelling, that they must ever learn to dwell. So Heidegger's account of the problem of dwelling proved to be very influential for the phenomenological school of architectural theory and practice in the last decades of the 20th century. So in the work of Christian Norberg-Schultz and Kenneth Frampton, we can see acknowledgements of Heidegger's ideas as a foundation for attempts to recuperate traditional forms of dwelling as a means of escaping the alienation, abstraction, and indeed the homelessness of modernity. Now, one dramatic counterpoint to this nostalgic reflex that's often been engendered by Heidegger's later writings on the question of dwelling is presented in the architectural philosophy of Massimo Cacciari. And in an often cited review he did in the late 1970s of a book by Tafuri and Dalco, his colleagues, Cacciari argues for an interpretation of Heidegger's thought which acknowledges how Heidegger radicalizes the discourse supporting any possible nostalgic attitude. And so, in fact, he argues that Heidegger is revealing how dwelling is, in fact, impossible in contemporary circumstances. So he says that Heidegger can't be simplistically appropriated for futile attempts to recreate forms of dwelling associated with a past age. And the definition of dwelling that Heidegger comes up with depicts a mode of living that is no longer possible. So rather than placing hopes in a possible return to poetic dwelling, Cacciari identifies in Heidegger's essays on dwelling an illumination of the essential character of spatial experience in modern life, which he poses in terms of the relationship between non-dwelling and the metropolis. So for Cacciari, non-dwelling is the essential characteristic of life in the metropolis. The history of contemporary architecture, he says, is therefore a phenomenology of metropolitan non-dwelling, or it should be such, since contemporary architecture aims at restructuring itself as the possibility of dwelling within the metropolis. So this casts the central problem for contemporary architecture as the coming to terms with its role in the conflict between the retrospective model of the city as a place of dwelling and the logic of the metropolis as the negation of that dwelling. So it's unsurprising then that Cacciari views urban planning as inevitably compromised in its search for a logic for the organisation and harmonisation of metropolitan functions, and in its attempts to synthesise the vast differentiation of urban life along the lines of the city as an organism. Because of its inability to ground this logic in anything other than an ideological orientation, this logic for Cacciari inevitably degenerates into an ethical imperative driven by an anti-metropolitan nostalgia for a lost poetic dwelling. This denial of the possibility of a synthesis of the disparate elements and fragmentary aspects of urban life leads Cacciari to conclude his essay with an acknowledgement of the power of Mies van der Rohe's functionalist architecture as reflecting the silent negation of dwelling within the metropolis. Well, the architectural implications of Cacciari's completed nihilism, as he refers to it, have been explored most thoroughly in the work of the colleague whose work he was talking about in that essay, Manfredo Tafuri. And in his wide-ranging critique of the pretensions of both architectural modernism and its avant-garde opponents, Tafuri rejects the idea that fundamental social change can be achieved through good design. Surveying the history of the 20th century artistic and architectural avant-garde, Tafuri identifies a unifying sensibility towards the submission of space to industrial planning. Each of these historical avant-gardes and attempts to develop radical architecture were part of a broader demand for a rational domination of the future through the organisation of processes of urbanisation. And as a consequence, these architectural theories and projects engaged with the disruptions and fragmentation of urban life, not by teaching us how to suffer the modernist experience of shock, in Benjamin's terms, but how one should absorb it and internalise it as an inevitable condition of existence. So instead of being understood as an isolated or subsequent moment of the organisation of production, Tafuri looks at the ideology of consumption as now being offered to us as a public ideology of the proper use of the city. And he identifies both architectural modernism and its avant-garde and radical opponents as engaged in the integration of the public as productive units in the cycle of production, distribution, consumption. So in this way, Tafuri sees the opposition between modernist functionalism and its other breaking down, as he describes in the following terms: order and disorder, understood in this way, no longer oppose each other. There's no contradiction anymore between constructivism and the art of protest, between the rationalisation of building production and the subjectivism of abstract expressionism, between the capitalist plan and urban chaos, between the ideology of planning and the poetry of the object. So for Tafuri, he argues that the attempts by the architectural avant-garde to challenge existing forms of social power purely through architecture or spatial design inevitably run up against limits which are not architectural but social. And this leads him to dismiss what he sees as the deluded attempts of architectural utopianism to mould and transform the city by means of the image alone. So in my concluding section here, I just want to sort of try and tie together some of these points. And it's obvious that the implications of the whole tradition of negative thought of Cacciari and Tafuri and its emergence out of the Italian autonomist Marxist movement in the 60s, I can't deal adequately with that whole lineage in this paper. But the acknowledgement for both of these writers of the impossibility of dwelling within the metropolis and the rejection of architectural solutions to social problems raises the question of whether architectural experiments such as the Sirius building are always condemned to failure. So in my view, the 40-year occupation of that landmark building by low-income residents was not so much a kind of utopian or nostalgic recuperation of dwelling. It wasn't some aberrant example of trying to insert dwelling within the metropolis, but it was a practical demonstration of what I call the politics of inhabitants. The building's construction was itself a collective reappropriation of the Rocks neighbourhood by its residents. Its landscape streetscape, its courtyard and roof gardens established a human scale to the exterior of the building, while the interior of the building was designed to cater for the needs of a diverse range of special needy residents and encourage interaction between residents in common spaces. And the access to balconies gave breathtaking views of the harbour bridge and the Opera House. So contrary to simplistic criticisms of the brutalist architectural style of the building as threatening or dominating, I think we can understand this building and its raw and honest construction as what Ollie Mould refers to as a relational form of architecture. So in an era where the collective dividends of the social democratic welfare state are always potentially under attack, the critique of the association between the reformist ambitions of bureaucratic state managers in housing and architectural utopianism, I think that kind of critique doesn't have as much purchase anymore. Perhaps certainly not as, doesn't seem as important as it was in the crisis-prone politics of 1970s Italy. And indeed, I think it seems much more appropriate to be defending this piecemeal attempt to insert radical architecture into the area of public housing. So as Lukáš Stanek points out, it's useful to contrast Tafuri's unrelenting critique of what he terms architectural ideology with Lefebvre's discussion of architecture as more than just a territorial projection of social relationships. For Lefebvre, architecture is also a medium through which particular social groups can define themselves and their identities within the social totality. And for Lefebvre, he sees the architectural imagination as a way of parenthesizing the pressures on the architect to subordinate themselves to the program of urbanism in order that they may, in fact, encourage imaginative possibilities. To do otherwise, he argues, is to lapse into the incessant repetition that there's nothing to be done, nothing to be thought because everything is blocked, because capitalism rules, co-ops everything, and because the mode of production exists as a system and a totality, it has to be rejected or accepted in accordance with the principles of all or nothing. So just in concluding, I'll say that the modest contribution of the Sirius apartments to maintaining a public housing presence in the Rocks area reminds us of previous utopian ambitions for universal housing, which have largely been removed from official discourse. Given that brutalism was originally understood as a political aesthetic, an attitude, a weapon dedicated to the precept that nothing was too good for ordinary people, this is in the words of Owen Hatherley, I think the building's design is also a reminder of the democratic orientations of previous public housing policies and of architecture's role in implementing them. So while the public campaign to save the Sirius building and other threatened public housing dwellings in inner city Sydney have had to rely on restricted definitions of heritage as a means of resisting government plans to sell off properties and evict residents, the underlying principle of this struggle that has been defended all along is a right to collective luxury, an entitlement to inhabit the inner city in dignity. This is a right from which no one should be excluded. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks also for the acknowledgement of country. I was really remiss in not doing that at the top of the hour, and I apologise for my carelessness. And I'll just take a moment now to say that I, here at the ANU, am hosting this session on unceded Ngambri and Ngunnawal land, and I do pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Chris, your paper was a fabulous kind of quilting point, but between the other papers here, because it seems to me it really connects backwards through the idea of geography to what Margaret was talking about. And I thought that what you were saying about dwelling was in particular important to both your paper and to Margaret's paper. And I think here of the old 100th hymn, all creatures who on earth do dwell, as actually having a lot of weight that both in your paper and in the work that Margaret's doing, and the word dwelling is really interesting there. So pointing backwards through geography to Margaret and pointing forward through neoliberalism to what I want to very briefly talk about, subbing for Jessica White on this occasion in thinking about neoliberalism, but I guess I'll do it in my own way by showing people a bunch of pictures. So I'll just switch on the sharing. And is that all right? Is that people seeing the screen now? Yeah, Jan, is that working?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to say that I'm thinking about neoliberal images and imaginaries in relation to public space. And I start from the idea, and I just put on my own timer here so that I don't rabbit on endlessly. That'll help. Public space, I think, is not a metaphor. If you go back to the Agora and the Forum that became metaphors of public space, but before they were metaphors, they were real places where people really gathered, the Agora, the marketplace, the Forum, the meeting place. And the idea that the public space was a place where people meet face-to-face continues through the literature on public space, through Benjamin's idea of the flaneur, through Hannah Arendt and the space of appearance, through Habermas and the coffee house. So the actual physical, the way in which we imagine the physical space of public participation is, I think, not just metaphorical but real. And I wanted to just to point out a few different ways in which this space might be pictured. And I'm showing here, of course, a very famous fresco on the walls of the Centre of Government in Siena from 1339, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Effects of Good Government. And really this marvellous, huge fresco, several metres long, a couple of metres high, that is in this kind of central governing space in Siena. It's public space itself which is the hero of this picture. The argument being developed by this fresco is that law and security are there precisely in order to make space public, in order to allow the flourishing of public space that, as you can see in this picture, is embodied in multiple different ways: commercial transactions, social transactions, creative transactions, all of these different ways of interacting and being in the central squares of Siena. And the centre of this is this dancing group in the middle there. And I'll say, drawing on Quentin Skinner here, that in fact, the picture, which comes from the very early days of the use of three-point perspective in Renaissance art, is an odd use of perspective. It's an odd use of perspective because if you look at it very carefully, you'll see that the distances relative to different spaces don't seem to line up with the way in which we, the viewer, are looking at the picture, which is the classic idea behind the development of Renaissance perspective by Alberti and people like that. Instead, the focal point for the perspective seems to be coming from inside the picture, and things are measured in relation to their distance from that place inside the picture. And the same is true of the source of light. The source of light in the picture, it doesn't seem to be coming so much from a sun, for example, from an off an off canvas point, but it somehow seems to be lit from within, and specifically from the dancing group in the middle. The dancing group in the middle are the focal point, both for the way in which perspective is developed in this picture and the way in which light is used in this picture. And if we look here at the dancing group, we see one person holding a tambourine and 9 dancers. And this, to me, I think is the heart of a representation of the public space as a place in which a dance takes place. And we could develop that metaphor, that highly embodied understanding of public participation as being about harmony and coordination of individual movements into a coherent and pleasing whole in which we all share and we all participation. Of course, the number 9 is the mystical number, both in this picture and in Siena as a whole. The room in which the frescoes are painted is called the Hall of the Nine. The 9 were the 9 people who governed Siena. They were the magistrates and the legislators of Siena. And 9 is also, at the same time, the number of the muses. So it connects together the politics of Siena, the legitimacy of the constitution, and also aesthetic pursuits. And the dance here, I think, is both the expression of the imaginary of political freedom, the freedom to dance, which of course is not a freedom that neoliberalism understands for a second. And is also a suggestion here that dancing is a kind of actual affective pedagogy that constitutes our relations with each other within a public, that shows a respect both for individuals and for collectives of order and principle and practice and being in a really rich and creative way. So I think that the dance here and the figures of the 9 dancers here, as they twine and encircle each other in this beautiful kind of representation, is a representation of the value of public space and the importance of public space, the responsibility of law and security precisely to create the space in which dancing can take place. Now, if we go forward, I mean, a long time, I know, to Hobbes. I'm not going to spend too much time on Hobbes because I know it's an image that is by now sort of very familiar to many people. But in Hobbes's Leviathan, this image of, we get a very different sense of public space, and that's really what this picture is here, is just to highlight a very different vision of public space. If you look at the close-up on the right of the city that is protected by the figure of the Leviathan or the Commonwealth at the top of the frontispiece, it's fundamentally an empty public space. If you look at it's a public space in which people, and certainly not dancing, Hobbes not creating a space for people to dance. The only people that we see in the city are soldiers and plague doctors. I've circled both of those figures on the right-hand side. This is a space in which people are the enemy of public space, and that the dream of the public space is an empty and controlled public, controlled by soldiers and plague doctors. Now, the plague doctors are by no means coincidental. If we go back to the Siena, that picture of an open, vibrant public space was painted in 1339. 1348 is when the Black Death arrived in Siena, and within a year or so, half the population of Siena was dead. And so it was really, the Lorenzetti is really the end of a certain vision of public space and the gradual replacement with a kind of an image more like Hobbes. England suffered over and over again from the plague, not just in the 1350s, but it regularly returned, decimating the population, particularly of London, over and over again. And most recently, both shortly before and shortly after the Civil War. So Hobbes had both the Civil War and the plague in his mind when he envisaged these ideas of space. As Foucault says in his famous remarks about this and other kind of ideas, the exile of the leper and the arrest of the plague do not bring with them the same political dream. The political dream of public space we see here, which I see as a kind of foreshadowing or forewarning of neoliberalist ideas, an early formulation that would be very important for the neoliberal thinkers, is a political dream of absolute control and constraint rather than of freedom or indeed of dancing. So that brings us, I think, as Chris has already raised this point, Jessica, I was hoping, would be able to speak to this idea that neoliberalism is fundamentally scared of public space because public space is a place in which collective action can be both understood, prioritised and taken. And that's entirely anathema to a neoliberal vision of isolated, commodified individuals governed by a very thin understanding of self-interest. And it's very clear from Jessica White's work that democracy and public spaces were always the enemy of neoliberalism and never big government. The story that neoliberalism is opposed to big government is entirely wrong, at least on Jessica White's reading. It was democratic governance that created spaces for the appearance of an understanding of communal, social or collective entities that was really the problem. And so, as Chris has already alluded for us, what neoliberalism has done over the last 20 or 30 years is turn public life into private life and public space into private space. One classic example, of course, is the change from the piazza to the shopping mall, a public space into a private space which has regulated very differently and in which political action is understood entirely differently. An even better example, I think, comes from the recent debate, which you may recall, over the that the vision, as Foucault says, the exile of the leper and the arrest of the plague do not bring with them the same political dream. In Hobbes's Leviathan, you see here an image of a public space stripped of social or individual activity and replaced by soldiers and plague doctors to discipline and constrain the population. And that's very much one of the animating visions of neoliberalism. As White says, neoliberalism has fundamentally been opposed to public space and democracy because they are seen to threaten the commodified and individualised understanding of the values of the world. So neoliberalism's fundamental project has been to turn public life into private life and public space into private space. One example, as I mentioned, possibly one of the things that got cut off was a shopping mall, which is not the same as a piazza, but has replaced it. And so rather than being a free space for public assembly, it's governed by corporate entities, and the kind of political action you can undertake in a shopping mall is almost non-existent. Your purpose in the shopping mall is not to assemble and debate, but to buy. And I think that the debate about the Opera House a couple of years ago is a really classic example of this kind of dispute. You'll remember that what happened here was that corporate entities wanted to use the Opera House to screen images from a horse race to promote a commercial activity, and the Opera House management refused. And then there followed this imbroglio between Alan Jones, who you'll all know, and the head of the Opera House, Louise Heron. And you can see that debate on the right-hand side, and I won't try and imitate Alan Jones' harping, cantankerous kind of voice. You can hear that for yourself. But what we see here is an image, something which captures precisely a difference of view about what it meant for something to be public. For Jones, to be public meant that it should be rented. It should be sold. That was what being public meant. It was to maximise profit of individual interests. And if you weren't doing that, then you weren't acting in the interests of the public. Whereas the Louise Heron, the CEO of the Opera House, and many people, of course, as well, who gathered together to protest against this kind of approach, argued, is that it's precisely because it was a public asset that it was not to be rented, that it was not to be sold, that it was not to be commodified in this kind of way. So we see here two fundamentally different visions about what it means for something to be public and how that relates to individual interests or to public good. And I won't belabor the point that what we've seen in recent years is a whole raft of legal actions and legal changes which have gradually and steadily reduced possibilities for democratic participation and public space. Laws about assembly, about security, about foreign intervention, laws that prevent so-called secondary boycotts and that separate public interest in certain activities, for example, environmental regulation, from what the government likes to call legitimate legal interests, which means private property interests. I'll just stop for a second there and just check to see that people can still hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. And we can
okay,
see.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just go on there to what I think is another really interesting example of what I'm trying to articulate as a neoliberal imaginary of public space. And that's a recent video game, a very simple video game. It was very popular for a moment, but I guess like many things, these things bubble up for a moment and then get replaced by something else. For a while, it was a game a lot of people were playing on their phones. And it's a simple game in which your job, there you are as the green figure with the blue bolster, is to push all of these people who are, let's say, assembling illegally off, and in the language of the game, to clean the zone. And the people who are thus cleaned, you can see them on the right, some of them holding their hands out, some of them trying to hide, fall into either fire or water. And your technique is to try and clear the zone as efficiently as you can. In some ways, this seems to me perfectly to capture the kind of imaginary of public space that we first saw hinted at in the frontispiece to Hobbes' Leviathan, and is now a kind of a mainstream understanding. The idea that the assembling of people for purposes of political action or conversation is a kind of dirt or pollution. It's a connection then, which we see also in the pandemic, between public health and state power. The pandemic, just like Hobbes, gives us a kind of a language of cleaning and of tidying up an area so that the perfect public space is the empty public space, the open place with maybe just a couple of pot plants, a bench here and there, in which people move through rather than staying in. Wendy Brown, in her work on neoliberalism, talks about the desublimation of the will to power. Neoliberalism turns everything into a game in which the only value is one's skill in the game and in which there are no normative considerations at all. And I think that, therefore, to see an image of the neoliberal imaginary in a video game is exactly right? It's exactly opposite, that we should start thinking of the management of publics as a kind of game that rewards people who can, administer the bolster in the most effective kind of way. What was most striking for me, as well as this kind of language of zone cleaned, right, of cleanliness as being emptiness, an idea that we do see in Hobbes, but is exactly the opposite of the idea we see in Lorenzetti, in which the cleanliness of the public space is its fullness, its liveliness, rather than its emptiness. It's not at all swept clean. But here's another quick still from the video game. Sorry, the quality of the image is not very good, but you'll see, in giving you a hint about how to play the game, it says if you throw somebody overboard, you're legally skilled. Now, I mean, I may be guilty here of overthinking it, but it seems to me remarkable that here we've got the languages of not just pushing but throwing overboard, right, an active, intentional act, the language of overboard exactly in the time of refugees, in which children overboard is, something very redolent in Australian cultural and political history. And that this is connected not just to skill, but to legal skill, right? It's not just that you can do it. It's not just the desublimation of the will to power that's going on here, but a language of legitimacy. The implication is not just that you can be good at mowing down the protesters and cleaning the space, but that it is necessary and that it is right. You are legally skilled implies a kind of a rightness in the action. So there's a vision here of a clean and empty public space, a peaceful and silent public sphere that is anathema to these other images of public space. And it is articulated with an uncanny kind of precision in this little video game. So I think that the name of that game is Push 'em All. And I think the Australian government's goal, in line with the whole tradition of public space thinking from neoliberal thought over the last 30 or 40 years, is to push them all. And the legislation about protests, about terrorism, about security, about control, about authorisation, about foreign intervention, all of those things are getting ready for the end game of pushing them all. And our goal, it seems, is to push them back. And I think in that process of pushing back, of rolling back this way of thinking about of public space, the physicality, the materiality, as Margaret would say, of the messy public presence should not be minimised, and neither should we minimise the power of aesthetics to participate in these discourses about the nature of how we are present in the physical world around us. Thank you. So I sometimes have lined up a little applause line here so people can feel like they can participate, but I haven't organised myself to do that yet. But I'm going to thank myself, and I'm going to thank Chris, and I'm going to thank Margaret for those papers, and I'm going to open it now for questions. So if you want to ask a question, you could chuck something in the chat line, or you could just pipe up. I might just start while people are thinking, and I encourage everybody to tell me if they've got a question to ask. Go back to Margaret just for a second. And I guess I'm just trying to see if, Margaret, are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry. Limited kind of screen capacity here. So it was really great what you were saying. And I started off with a fairly kind of, I don't know how you'd put it. I wouldn't say pedantic, but scholarly kind of question, which is how do you distinguish yourself from the earth jurisprudence kind of movement? What's different, distinctive about what you're doing? But as you spoke, I started to think of something else. And I liked your language. You started talking at one point about recognition and bond and purpose. And I heard there kind of normative principles that you were trying to draw out of it. And then I started to think, well, wait a second. Of course, there is a prehistory to this, right? And that prehistory goes back to people like Huxley and Spencer and the survival of the fittest. They also thought that we could draw normative principles from the earth that we could then apply or think about in relation to human populations, right? But the survival of the fittest was an extremely dangerous kind of normative principle to be drawing on, right? And it led to a lot of, dangerous things, including, eugenics and so forth, racism and other things. And of course, I know you don't want to be associated with any of that. So my question then is, there must be some kind of meta-norms that are helping you think about what are the norms that we can properly or rightly draw from our observations and our thinking about the biotic world, right? The world around us. Where do those come from, or how do we choose from what might be a multitude of different normative principles, the ones that we think are really appropriate or relevant to thinking in this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Des. And before I answer that question, like you, I'd like to obviously point out that I was also remiss in not acknowledging the Ghana people on whose land I'm sitting and speaking from, and just the fact that it's a symptom of some privilege that I could, and also of ongoing colonialism, that I could so easily forget that. So the way I'm thinking, it's not so much that I want to draw out norms and normativity from these processes of nature. It's more an analysis at this stage of the fact that there is normativity in the geological and biological world and the intersection. So I'm really seeing it as an analysis of multiple intersecting normative systems. You might say it's an extended view of legal pluralism, a very materialist idea of legal pluralism. And there's no linearity in any of this. So I take a lot from the systems theory, complex systems theory in particular, that rejects the idea that these processes are linear. In fact, they're non-linear. They're constantly interrupting and bifurcating and changing, each other. So it would be quite simplistic to draw norms for human law out of the natural world. What I draw out of, or what I try to explain, is that there is a normativity and that there is some continuity, but also discontinuity between, broadly speaking, nature. Put that in parenthesis, obviously, because it's a problematic term, and human law. They are connected, they are entangled, but there's no kind of straightforward lessons to be learned from nature. And nature is, we shouldn't idealise it either. It's violent and destructive in many forms. So, but it's the fact of normativity that exists, and that's probably where I would also differentiate myself from earth jurisprudence, some of which does kind of take a more idealist notion of nature and natural law and then try to apply it to physical nature. I've never been a great fan of the idealist and religious tradition of natural law, as most people would realise. And so, but I do think that there is a way in which it's possible to speak about the normativity of nature as long as you're speaking about physical law. And there's an awful lot within science theory and within the counter traditions of the West that pull in that direction, that show us that that's possible. There's also, of course, everything that we're learning constantly from Indigenous peoples. And I don't engage specifically with ideas of Indigenous law, although they are always there and always an inspiration and, in some sense, guide to this kind of thinking. But my objective is really to develop the legal theory that I am situated within, in a sense, so that it has more epistemic openness, if you like, to those.
Okay. That's good, actually. Epistemic openness is quite helpful. Also certainly helpful to me, yeah. That's great. Another question. Who has a question to ask? Yep. Tim, did you want to say something?
Yes, if I may. So,
yep, please.
Thank you, Margaret, Chris, and Des, for a fantastic series of presentations, and it's lovely to see you all. I essentially have a question that I want to pose to all three of you, but it came out of Des, your paper, and it's essentially a question about how the aesthetics of harmony are functioning through each of your projects. And Des, it sort of came out of your comment about the Fresco and the public space as being this space of coming together, and you mentioned it being a space of coordination and a space of harmony. And what struck me about that is, you're talking about a critique of neoliberalism and a neoliberal approach to public space, but neoliberalism itself has, its own aesthetics of harmony in terms of the market, and the invisible hand is this sort of self-interest is producing a form of harmony. So I was wondering how that sort of navigates in your paper, Chris. In the serious apartment and the criticisms of it comes to an aesthetic harmony or aesthetics of harmony at one level, right? Because it's being criticised, from the outside because of how it looks and the way in which the market wants to push that particular geographic or urban area. And yet you sort of talk about like an internal harmony as to, the common spaces of the building and the uses that are going on there. And then Margaret, and I think you kind of addressed this in your response to Des a little bit, but I was wondering how, that notion of harmony fits within, you're drawing upon these normativities of the earth in your theorization of eco-law. So thank you.
Chris. Still can't hear you.
Yeah, I just got to remember the number of buttons I need to press to get back in the action. Thanks, Tim. Good to see you. I just wanted to respond to something you said there about the aesthetics. It's quite an interesting thing to see, even just reading media reports about the sale of the building, because it's a while since I've sort of been following updates on the sort of politics of that whole issue. And it's kind of amazing to look at the way a building that was being characterised by members of the New South Wales government as being, revolting, ugly, looks like a car park, knock it down. They sell it off, and then suddenly it's a design icon now. It's like brutalism's okay if it's in the right hands. It's not okay if it's being owned by the public and is being there for the enjoyment of the unwashed. And, as soon as ownership changes hands, then that kind of fits in quite nicely to that notion, I guess, Des is talking about Jessica's articulation of neoliberalism is not really about some kind of pure market-driven thing. There's actually, there's a morals there. There's a kind of deliberate attempt to structure things in a certain way. And it's, if as long as the right people are in charge, as long as they're owning it, then, the aesthetics get appropriated by a new set of owners. So the power of exchange is kind of politicized in a way, like it's actually comes with, state power is articulated to a particular version of market aesthetics, but it's not natural. It's not something that just appears or emerges freely. So, yeah, thanks. That was a good point.
Margaret, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Very good point. It has made me think a bit as well because, obviously, as I said, nature is not necessarily a harmonious place. It is in some respects, but it's also violent and destructive. Symbiosis is about eating the other as well as kind of coexisting with the other. So there's all of that, but it did make me reflect a little bit more on myself because, there used to be, and there still is to a certain degree within science theory and within physics, this idea that you could come up with a theory of everything. And I was always very dismissive of that idea, and yet still I find myself as a legal theorist trying to come up with a normative theory of everything. So there is that sort of image in my head that you can have that totalizing theory, and in a way that's kind of what I'm doing here, except that I wouldn't ever pretend that it was a theory of everything. It's just or at least I would try not to pretend that, even though there might be some of that motivation there. So obviously it's just one slice or one kind of way of describing a complicated pattern of things that I can see. But yeah, I agree. It's a kind of a motivation, that harmonious theoretical explanation.
I think, I think it's an absolutely fair point, and I think actually, in some of the work that I've done, written about these particular ideas, there comes a point where I say, yeah, but hang on a second, which is basically what you just said, right? Yeah, but hang on a second. These things are not a million miles from each other, and there's clearly in the Lorenzetti, there's this kind of, which I've called, it's the visual constitution of Siena. So there is this conscious evident idealization and sublimation, we would say, the sublimation of difference into this kind of bigger picture of unity or togetherness or coordination or something. And I think you're right to say that that's something to be careful of, as well as something to kind of celebrate. I mean, I think the picture itself is not just about the dance, that it's more complicated and it's messier than that. And I think that my own idea of a public space is more connected to ideas of agonism or agonistic democracy, in which difference is not solved by a dance move, and that the kind of harmony is something that we can see from a distance, but which is not experienced on the day-to-day. So I'm kind of aesthetically in favour of a more messy kind of approach to what the public is, and that's where I tried to end what I said. So I think I wouldn't want to simply hold up the Lorenzetti as being, this is right and Hobbes is wrong, but they both articulate particular kinds of images of public space that I think are really important. But I think there are other images that are perhaps closer to an idea of messiness, imperfection, and a kind of an ongoing and unfinished dialogue. And thank you, because that's given me a momentum to go and think a little bit more about where we might find those images and what they might say. So thanks a lot, Tim. Bradley, did you want to come in? There's a long chat line here. You may want to speak to it.
Certainly, thank you, team. Hang on, I'm just seeing if I could. There we go. Sitting at home in my couch. So, look, sorry for the long line that obviously steered away from discussing there. I'm going to read it out. I thought I worded it okay the first time around, so sorry for that. It's a question for Margaret. Firstly, compliments, of course. Brilliant stuff. Always a pleasure to listen and hear more about the jurisprudence you're sculpting here. One thing that occurred to me during your line of response to Desmond's initial question, and it particularly emerged in a comment which you've since repeated, about the artificiality of the nature and artificiality distinction, right? That's not something that we can care to sustain. We can't engage with that. It seems that the way that you're moving towards things here, we've got such a holisticism of normative sources. Everything gets into the analysis, everything gets into our normative sort of posture, that there seems this risk of ending up stating that we've all been pluralists, earthists, Gaiists all along. We've all been in this space. The thing that I want to ask there, can I trouble you for a sharp statement of your transformative aspirations? What kind of intervention in the space of norms you're looking at building here? If there is this risk of us becoming so normatively all-encapsulating that we theorize ourselves out of intervention in the space of norms, So the context for this, I can appreciate a clear gain to a comprehensive theory of normativity, but I'm also conscious of the classic orthodox thought that this could be ethically paralyzing, and that's my fear.
So that's interesting. That's good. Where do I start? So I think in terms of what is the transformative intervention, I think it is it's a mode of thinking, and it's a mode of thinking that is aiming to start our understanding of normativity from a different place, that's somewhere else from where we normally start that discussion or understanding of normativity, at least within Western legal theory. So starting that from a different place, I think, gives a different image of law, and it gives a different, it kind of decenters human law in the, or at least Western state-based human law within the idea of normativity that's generated. So for me, I mean, any approach can't do anything, can't do everything, and in fact, maybe it can't do very much at all. And for me, maybe this is enough. This is what I think I can do at the moment. It's not to say it can't be extended in different ways, but and there is a holism to it, but it's also a pluralism. I mean, it's a holism that isn't a holism. It's a holism of interconnecting normative systems, which each have their own kind of independence, and that can be addressed or thought as independent normative systems, regardless of the fact that they kind of interact in this bigger idea that I'm talking about. So that's the main answer, that it's a kind of reorientation or a kind of standing in a different position from where we normally stand, and I think that is an ethically important kind of step to one side to take. It doesn't necessarily negate or eschew any other political interventions at all. It's just a different thinking process. Yeah. So I think that's what I would say about that. But there are, of course, I mean, I mentioned Karen Barad. There are, of course, lots of ways to talk about the ethical aspects of material connections. She talks about that at the level of electrons, but of course, ecologists talk about it at different levels. So I think that those are always aspects that need to be brought front and centre in this kind of discussion as well.
Thank you. Now we're running out of time, but I reckon we've got time for one more question. If there was somebody else had a question, that would be great. Pipe up. Rick. G'day, Rick. How are you?
I'm well, Des. I'm just turning on cameras and microphones and so on. Thanks to you all very much. That was great. And what a collection to put together. Margaret, I was profoundly disturbed by your work because you've taken law, which was, started originally. It came from the idea of the Roman idea of law into the common law, and Bacon, I believe, applied it to science, and so there's both the idea that there are regularities in Bacon's idea of law, and also there's the idea that it's God-given and that it's got authority behind it. And so you've taken law, and by continuing this application through both the natural world and the human world, you've kind of turned it upside down, I think. I'm not quite sure. In fact, I'm a little worried that perhaps you haven't turned it upside down enough. And we've still got this kind of thing out there that's both common law and scientific law, a la Francis Bacon. So that's just I'm still thinking about that. Can I also just go on to mention, while I've got a chance, something about Desmond's wonderful image of the dance in Lorenzetti's Fresco, and to say that I've been working on similar stuff trying to work out how we can overcome neoliberalism and the terrible individualism that we're finding in people who don't want to stop the pandemic, or people or do the things that would stop the pandemic, or who don't want to do things that would save the earth. And I think I've been getting around to things about bodies and how we need to reconnect with bodies, not just as individual things, but as something convivial. And I think your image of the dance is beautiful. And I want to go back to that because everything else was so gruesome after that. Although Chris reminded us of good public housing, and there is still some good public housing on the waterfront in Balmain and so on, and that's always an image that we can go back to. So, Des, thank you for the image of the dance, because I will always that will stay with me. Yeah. And Boyan Manchev says bodies that need to be considered as the dynamic immanent in subjects as a site of the potentiality of life, and the body can do anything. Le corps peut tout, which I think we've got to get back to the body, and we've got to get back to the body in public space, and it's so hard at the moment to do that with the shutdown of public space. So thank you all so much, and sorry if that's not really a question, but I would love some comment back on those points.
Well, I'll just jump in quickly, and then if Margaret has something to add about what Rick said. Too scientific or not scientific enough? That was kind of the question there. But yeah, I mean, Rick, you obviously, I agree with you. I think there is something about that picture, and it's wonderful to see it in detail like that, to see the luminousness, the light that comes from the dancers, the beautiful detail in all of that work, the sense that you really have that they're physically moving. Bruegel is another painter who does that, who gives you a sense of bodies in action rather than just bodies posed in some way and still on the page. Lorenzetti is just kind of really wonderful for that. And I agree with you that there's something moving and inspiring as a kind of a dream of how we respect each other's bodies as we move around this world, and what that says for how we interact with each other, as Margaret would perhaps say, a kind of normativity in our bodily interactions, the normativity that we have in a dance, the normativity that we have when we walk on the street and we know how to step aside, how to give space for people, how our bodies in complicated spaces are able to adjust to each other. There's something there that is about the truth of who we are as human beings, and it's a truth that is completely annihilated by the abstract and commodified image that we get from neoliberalism. I don't even want to talk about it because it does something certainly that I feel is kind of just hurtful in talking like that. And I think one of the things that all three people on this panel have in common is that sense of the hurt that is inflicted by taking bodies out of spaces, whether we mean literally or conceptually. Some damage has been done. And the effort that we're struggling with now is how to undo that damage. Did you want to say something, Margaret, or will I just...
No, I don't think I can add to that. It was perfect.
Okay.
Perfect, thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. It was lovely to see everybody. I'm just going to quickly push forward here and say we've got a whole program of activities here. I don't expect everyone to go to everything, but there's a whole range of things. I've put in a link to the program that you can access through the chat line. And I'll mention here 3:30 this afternoon, live from Helsinki, but including our own Dorota Gosdecker, who helped put it together, Law, Politics and Emptiness. Later on today, I'll be speaking live with Kerry Young about her artwork, including her film on the Palais de Justice, which is a pretty fantastic film. That's called In the Eyes of the Law, and it comes from Lucerne at 8 p.m. tonight. And then tomorrow morning, bright and early so that it's still Thursday, European and American time, 9:30 tomorrow morning, we come back to Melbourne with a program called In and Out of Place at the University of Melbourne. You can find out more about all of that material if you go to the website online, and I look forward to seeing at least some of you there for some of the time. I think that's it for everybody. Thank you so much.